So good evening. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for everyone that's joining us here and at the other sites as well as over GoToMeeting. This is really our first system-wide or consortium-wide GME kind of evening faculty development retreat that we've put together. So we're excited to kick this off and hope to do this type of a event at least twice a year. We're fortunate that we have two folks that are going to be giving us the talks today, Dr. Daniel Steinberg and Dr. Helen Fernandez, and briefly introduce each of them before their talks. Just some housekeeping tips. We are going to be recording the session and then try to figure out how to make it available to anyone else who wants to look at it. If folks can mute the microphones at other sites so that we don't hear your background noise, and then when we go to the question and answer period, you can turn the mics back on. We're going to ask that people hold their questions so after each speaker speaks, and then we'll have a question and answer period. And we also have evaluation forms that we would like everybody to fill out. Very helpful for us in order to get feedback about not only this event, but if you have ideas or thoughts for other events or topics, we would like to hear that as well. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Daniel Steinberg, who's an internist and hospitalist at Mount Sinai Beth Israel, and he's also the internal medicine program director. We're fortunate to have him come speak to us today about writing letters of recommendation for students and residents, tips to complement your own style. So we thought that this would be a really timely topic as we get ready to ramp up for yet another residency and fellowship recruitment season. So I want to welcome Dr. Steinberg. Thank you.
So thanks, Bridget, and I'd like to thank GME office, Dr. Lightman and Sophie for her help, for inviting me to speak. I hope to give you a useful talk, and the goal of my talk is really to provide you with tips and approaches to writing letters that you can use immediately. So if you have a letter to write tonight, or tomorrow, I hope you'll take away some practical tips. A little bit about me. I've been program director in medicine at Mount Sinai Beth Israel since 2009. And I read a lot of letters of recommendation that have been written on behalf of medical students. In my role in residency recruitment, as I recruit a PGY1 class of about 50 each year. So I certainly read at least a few hundred, if not more, letters about medical students each year. I also write a lot of letters for fellowship for my PGY3s who are applying for fellowship. And I write letters for medical students as well. So with that, I'll just point out the title. So there's an important qualifier in the title, which is tips to complement your own style. And I put that in there because I know there are a lot of great writers in the audience and at the other sites. And my intent here is not to tell people how to write. I encourage people to continue their own style, and I'm sure there are people who are better writers than me. I just, would like to give you some tips that you can incorporate. So I have no disclosures. Our learning objectives for today are: number one, describe how letters of recommendation fit into the application process. At the end, I'd also like you to be able to implement an efficient approach to the letter writing process. I'd like you to be able to identify characteristics of effective and ineffective letters. And I'd like you to be able to use impactful words and phrases to describe performance. Finally, I'd like you to be able to recognize when you shouldn't write a letter. So in order to understand letter writing, I think it's good to have a big picture understanding of the application process. And now, we're not talking about any specific population here, students or residents in any particular programs, but I think this is a basic schematic of how medical schools and fellowship programs go about their recruitment. So it starts sort of at the top here. You have a large applicant pool to start, which narrows as the process goes on. And I'm using the cursor here so that people at the outside sites can follow along. So we usually get a lot of applications submitted. And then the first step that programs have to make is, do we invite the people who have applied for an interview? And there are particular decision criteria for that first step. And after you've decided who you're going to invite for an interview, you have a much smaller pool. You narrow the pool further after you interview these folks, and then you decide whether you're going to rank them or not. And for the medical school equivalent would be, are you going to offer them admission after you have interviewed them. And there's often a different set of decision criteria that goes into that second step. So I'll take you through some of the data. Now, the first question we should ask is, do letters of recommendation matter? For example, for medical students who are applying to residency, are they useful? So this is a survey of program directors across the country in all fellowships and residency programs. It's done by the National Residency Matching Program. This is the 2014 study. There was about 1,900 program directors in all specialties, 52.6% response rate. And they asked program directors to rank the importance of factors influencing those two steps that I had on the previous slide. So what factors do you take into account in your decision to invite for an interview, and what factors do you then weight when you're making a decision to rank? So here is a chart from the NRMP. This is from the study, and you can see up at the top, this is for the first step, percentage of programs citing each factor and mean importance rating for each factor in selecting applicants to interview. So what you can see here is the step one is the highest cited, and that for those program directors or fellowship directors in the room, it may be less applicable to fellowship directors because this was really for programs, but that is really the first apples to apples objective piece of data that programs get about medical students. So it's not surprising that that's there. But look at what's cited next. So letters of recommendation in the specialty. And then you can go on down for the rest of them. So letters are pretty high in the decision to interview. If we look at the decision to rank, program directors ranked letters fairly high as well. It looks like it's sixth on the list, okay? And what you can see is, as you might imagine, when people come for an interview, things like interactions with the faculty in the interview and interpersonal skills and feedback from house staff and residents, those things start to matter more because that's what the interaction and the day of the interview is centered around. But letters are still up there. So I would say to you, yes, they matter. What about the value of letters for residents applying to medical subspecialties? Now, of course, this talk is not intended to only be about medicine. It's meant to be about all fellowships. But I think that the data that I'm most familiar with, and I think some of the most organized data out there is in medicine. So you can make some extrapolations from this as you like. This is a study that was a 2007 survey of fellowship and IM residency program directors. They surveyed 562 fellowship directors, a response rate of 52%. Appropriately, 81% of the fellowships were university-based, 19% community-based. That reflects the distribution of medical subspecialty fellowships across the country. So it was an appropriate sample in that respect. For some reason, the authors did not give the exact number of program directors who responded. I don't know why. I searched for it. I couldn't. I would have to contact the original author, and I just wasn't able to do that. But they had a 60% response rate. My guess would be that it would be at least a few hundred. That would be my guess. But you can take that with a grain of salt. So again, 54% university, 46% community, and that is representative of the distribution of programs in the country. So what did they find? So this is a chart that many of us in medicine who advise residents refer to. It is by no means ironclad data, but it's interesting. So on the left column, you can see these are the rankings from the fellowship program directors, what they thought were important. So they ranked the interview first, and they ranked letters of recommendation from known specialists second. And then there are other things down here that we may be familiar with, the internal medicine program director, university-based residency, et cetera. Internal medicine program directors, folks like myself, we rank letters first, and publications second, and then the interview, and then the program director letter that we write fourth. So, can you make perfect conclusions from this? No, but what you can see is there's some concordance in that letters are at the top of both of those lists. For those of you who are familiar with the medical subspecialties and are wondering sort of about some of these things, I will tell you that one of the caveats about this study the authors pointed out was you'll see that publications is fairly low. According to the fellowship program directors, there was sort of a subgroup analysis, if you will, a second question, And what they found was in the more competitive medical subspecialties like gastroenterology and cardiology in particular, those two in particular, publications were much more important than represented on this chart. So that's a little bit of data about medical subspecialties. So my first tip, as I take you now through the process of writing a letter of recommendation, is to work smart. So we're busy, we forget, we have lots going on in our lives. So the first thing I would do is I would ask the trainee, the medical student or the resident, for a couple of things to help you organize. The first is an updated CV. I think that's very reasonable. The second would be a personal statement if they have it ready. You might even ask them if they have a draft they can send you, but if you can get that, that would be great. The third point I think is very important. I found it to be very helpful to ask the trainee to remind you of your interactions with them. So you may be approached for a letter by a resident or a student who you worked with like 8 months ago, and you may remember their face and that they're nice or whatever, that they were good, but if you remember that they were nice and they were good, that's not enough material for you to write a good letter. You need more. You'll get some of that in the CV, in the personal statement, but what you really would like to get, if possible, is what were the presentations they did? What were the great things they did at the bedside? Who were the patients they bonded with? What were the great moments of brilliance that you praised them for? And they'll remember those things, right? Because that's why they're asking you for a letter. But they should remind you of those things, and then you'll be able to reference them. The last thing that's important is a form or waiver. So any resident who's asking you for a letter that's going to go through ERAS, and certainly any student has a form that should accompany the letter request, which is their waiver. It's important for them to waive their right. It protects you. Students have the right to their medical education records. It's sort of like a Freedom of Information Act, if you will, in medical education. The waiver, what it does is it limits their access to the letter. And it gives you a little bit of liability against defamation lawsuits. And there are a couple of cases in the 80s before this law was in place where those types of things happen. Also, when students don't waive their right to a letter, it's sort of a red flag for program directors. So the next is really about setting the pace. You want to let the trainee know how much time you need to write a letter. You want to tell them this as soon as you're asked. And then I would say you want to sort of memorialize that deadline or that agreement in an email. So for me, I usually tell people it's going to take me 2 months to write a letter. The reason I say 2 months is because I always have like 15 fellowship letters to write, and then I have, a whole bunch of student letters to write, and then I have all these other things that I have to do, just like everybody in the room and who's watching. So I give a pretty long lead period. And the way I do it is I set the expectations early. So if I'm working with a resident or with a student, for example, on the ward, or a resident on the ward, and they say, listen, could you write me a letter when the time comes? I know what my time period is. I know it's 2 months. And so I'll say, I'm happy to, but just so you know, I need 2 months notice. So, next year when you're a fourth year, or next year when you want to apply, just make sure you reach out to me early, okay? The caveat to that is, I believe strongly that our role as faculty is to be supportive of our medical students and our residents, irrespective of how good they are with timelines. So, if a student or a resident asks you for a letter and the deadline is like in 10 days or a week, unless you have something, absolutely immovable that you really can't do it, I always try to get the letter done. I just feel like that's why I'm here. So, but I do try to avoid that by setting expectations. Putting in the email lets you reference it later. Oh, what did I say? What did they say? And you can remind the student or the trainee. Okay. So this is Ernest Hemingway. It's a picture of him during World War I. He was an ambulance driver. I think he drove an ambulance for like a year or two even in World War I before he got wounded. And he has a great quote about the usefulness of drafts as an editing tool. So he wrote a letter to Charles Scribner, who I believe was a publisher at that time. It said, the longer I can stay away from it, the better it will be, as it gives me a whole new chance to see it cold and plug any gaps and amplify where there is any need. So to me, another aspect of working smart is starting the letter early enough so that you can put it away for a couple of days. For those of you who write, you may find that revision is a great editing tool. I certainly find that way. There's no surprise that he said this, because he's also quoted as saying, the first draft of anything is, and you can complete the sentence. So it's pretty consistent. The next piece of advice I would say is that every part of a letter tells. Okay, so you have to expect that the reader is going to be looking at a lot of different things. So some basics are, just remember that there's no one correct way to write a letter, but there is a correct way to write, and so you want to ensure that your grammar and spelling and formatting are perfect. It really has to be on your letterhead. I see every year a number of letters that are not on letterhead, and they just don't have the same impact. Next, you really have to be on time. If you commit to writing a letter, you have to be on time. Lateness can cost an applicant interviews, and I'll illustrate that how that is to you on the next slide. It may sound amazing, but I see letters all the time where they say David in the first paragraph, and then it says Don, in the second paragraph, and I don't know what that's supposed to mean. It could be a mistake, but who knows? I've seen the gender mixed up, and I've actually seen the specialty mixed up. This person will make an absolutely wonderful neurologist, except that they're applying for the categorical medicine program. So that's a problem for a couple of reasons. One, because what are the real intentions? But then, as a program director, it makes me wonder, is this person applying to two things, and they're not really telling me about it, and it sort of came out in a letter. So don't do that. The students shouldn't really do that. But so this is an example of a program director view of two ERAS applications. This is the program director ERAS dashboard. For program directors in the room, you may recognize this as the old dashboard. It's not the web-based one we were using, for this past year. But you can see here that here's applicant number 1. I can see that the transcript's in, the photo, the dean's letter, 4 letters, and their STEP USMLE transcript. This applicant here below has a transcript, photo, dean's letter, only 2 letters. Okay, so. And it may depend upon the quality of the letters, okay, but all other things being equal, programs, and I think medical schools as well, they like information about their applicants. And so what a shame if the trainee that you're supporting has everything in except your letter, and that, makes the difference, all other things being equal. And that's a real phenomenon. So it's important, and again, it's important to be on time. So people always ask me, how do I start a letter? Like, what's the first paragraph supposed to be like? So I figured I would just give you an example, and you can use this to refer to. There's copies of the slides, I think, when you come in. As well, I will make these slides available in electronic form. And the goal, as we start to look at some of the examples, is for you to use these slides as a resource, to refer to if you like. So here's how I would suggest starting. Dear program director, and the underlines are just for emphasis here in the discussion. I write to you in strong support of Johnny Smith and his application for residency in internal medicine. I served as Johnny's teaching attending for 4 weeks in August of 2014 while Johnny was completing his sub-internship in medicine at Mount Sinai Beth Israel. I directly observed Johnny at the bedside during our daily rounds. Johnny has waived his right to this letter under the FERPA Act. So a couple of points here. I think it's nice to start with a support statement here, just out of the gate. It's important in the first paragraph to tell the reader how you interacted with the applicant, okay, and for how long, and ideally where, because sometimes we will cross-reference these with the dean's letter. Say, oh, look at the dean's letter. Say, oh, this person was on medicine, and okay, so this is the letter, from that time. So it's nice to do that. You describe very quickly sort of what they were doing, completing a sub. This is a key phrase for those of us in GME. We know that we're all about direct observation of competence. We are looking for what you saw the applicants do, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So it's good to put that in there. I've seen this in many letters. People put this right up front, and it's just a nice way to start. It lets the reader know that there's going to be some direct observation-based evaluation coming. Then it says daily rounds gives the reader right away an idea of how often you interacted with them, and then the waiver is there. Okay. I think next, it's nice to just give a little bit of background about the applicant as a person. So what I would suggest is just show that you know something about them as a person. That's really it. Where they went to college, did they have any scholarships? Did they have any accomplishments? Were they a captain of a sports team or something? Did they have major hobbies or significant pursuits? I wouldn't say like, they like traveling and cooking, they put that on the RERAS application. But if they were, a concert pianist or something, since age 3. I mean, remarkable things like that I think are very nice to put in. Or some sort of incredible life story where, they've overcome, challenges and really had an exceptional, career. A word about challenges, though, I would not write at all about personal issues or illness. That is something that is better represented for students, by the dean's office diplomatically stated in the dean's letter, however they choose to do that, or for residents applying to fellowship, by the program director in the letter they will write, or how they choose to do it. It's not something that you should really be writing about. There are some exceptions. I think if you have a trainee who had an illness, a catastrophic illness, and it's very much a part of who they are and their story and their identity, and they're proud about it, and it's something that is known, and that might be a different story, but and that might be a good exception. But by and large, I would tread cautiously here. So people, sometimes ask me, what should I write about? Like, how do I break down the different areas and categorize them? So I have 2 suggestions for you in terms of frameworks that you can use. And the first, some of you may recognize, the ACGME core competencies, which are 6 areas that describe all of the training areas in medicine. They're actually a pretty good way to think about all the things that you may want to write about in terms of performance. And I'm not going to go through each one in detail here, although I will give you a way to follow up on that. But it's patient care and medical knowledge, practice-based learning and improvement, which is sort of teaching and how they learn, their interpersonal skills, and communication and professionalism. Systems-based practice, very briefly, is how they manage transitions of care and how they work with others and teams and manage the healthcare system. So I think this is a nice way to think about categories broadly. I would also refer everybody to, for those of you who are writing letters for residents who are going to fellowship, or for those of you who are writing letters for medical students who are going to residency, to look at the ACGME milestones for those programs. Some of you may be familiar with the milestones. It's part of the move to really competency-based education and graduate medical education. Every residency program and every fellowship has a set of milestones, and they're pretty detailed. And looking at them will give you an idea of what your applicant is expected to do in the program they're applying for. And I don't think you want to copy those things verbatim, but if you're looking for ideas about how to phrase things, that's a pretty good way to do it. Plus, it'll open your eyes, if you're not aware of the milestones, to the milestones, and I think that's something that's important for all faculty to be aware of. So, to learn further about these as an approach and a resource, I'll just direct you to the ACGME website, and you can look at those on your own. So, we'll talk about describing performance. So this is Miller's Pyramid, published by George Miller, I believe, in 1990 in Academic Medicine. And what it describes is the progression of training for both students and residents. So the most basic level is knows. So someone knows how to do something, or they know of it. The next would be they know how. And then the next would be they can show someone how, and then the highest level is that they're actually doing it. And if you think about this in your real life, at what point would you allow your child to go swimming in the deep end? When they know about swimming in the deep end? When they can describe all of the strokes and what the deep end is like? When they know sort of the physiology of the deep end, if you will? When they can talk about how one might swim, or when you can actually see them swim in the deep end and then you let them swim on the deep end on their own, right? So that's the idea. Graduate medical education is shifted to the top of the pyramid here. We're really looking for how people implement their knowledge into action. So with that, I'm going to talk a little bit more about describing performance in letters, with that in mind. So general principles for describing performance in letters. Number one would be try to paint a picture of the trainee doing as opposed to just knowing. So I think talking about people's fund of knowledge and talking about how smart they are, that's great, and that's really great to write about. But it shouldn't be the only thing. And what we're looking for, I think, at the residency and fellowship level more is the doing. Can they do these things? Can they implement what they know into practice? So it comes down to really just write about what you saw the trainee do. And this is our favorite phrase in graduate medical education called direct observation of competence. It means that you saw the trainee in action. And you can tailor this concept to your setting. So if you're with people on the wards, watching them with patients on the wards, or in the operating room, or in the lab, the concept applies everywhere. Another important thing is to use examples and be specific when you talk about performance, and I'll go through a couple of examples. So a great tool is to use comparisons. I'll give you a few suggestions that you can implement if you'd like. So here are 3 ways to compare. So Jane is in the top 10% of residents I've worked with in the last 3 years. Right? That gets the point across. Next one is, of the 4 sub-interns I worked with this year, John stands out as the best. Okay? The comparisons help distinguish people from the rest of the pack. And then David has as much potential as a student as any student I have had in my lab in the last 5 years. So all different ways of saying the same thing. Okay? Topic presentations, I'll give you a couple of examples of the difference between something that is vague and something that's a little more impactful potentially. So you could write, Sue gave a great topic presentation. Or you could write, Sue's presentation on hyponatremia was evidence-based, her literature sources were well chosen, and I was impressed with how she kept the team engaged. She fielded questions adeptly, which reflected her extensive background reading. So it has a lot more color, it's a lot more active, it's a lot more of the doing. It's a lot more of this student or this resident Sue in action. For physical exam skills, same thing. So you could say David has great physical exam skills, but what does that really mean? A little bit better might be, David reported hearing an S3 gallop and finding elevated JVP in a patient presenting with shortness of breath. He proposed that given the specificity of these findings in this context, acute pulmonary edema was likely. On rounds, both the resident and I concurred with his findings. It was impressive. So a little more color. Communication skills, so you certainly could say Mary's wonderful at the bedside, great thing to say. Or you could expand it a little bit and say Mary's wonderful at the bedside. She listens actively. She lets the patient tell their story, but also knows when to seek clarification and redirect the patient. She never uses jargon. She's always cognizant of patients' comfort and privacy. So these are all positive examples, and so if you're going to write these, they have to all be true, obviously, but just put that disclaimer in there. So describing what patients and families said is a very effective topic. I've seen it done in many letters, and it does add a special element to the letter about the student or the resident. And it also shows that the writer of the letter was clearly at the bedside and very involved. So here are 2 examples that represent things I've seen commonly. On my rounds with the team, multiple patients identified Mary as, quote, my doctor. This was a wonderful sign that Mary had formed a real connection with them. More than one patient asked if Mary could be their regular doctor, and I had to explain to them that she was still a student, right? What a nice thing to say about a student. The next, one patient's daughter remarked to me that David's professionalism, attentiveness, and his clear explanations of things had really eased her nerves and helped her family understand and cope with things. I've seen both of these multiple times, and I've used them myself. So I find them to be effective. Other things you can write about, we can go back to the data. So this is, again, these are the factors that program directors in all specialties, not just medicine, all specialties, use to rank applicants applying to residency. So we talked about letters, but there are a few other things, right? So interpersonal skills is very high. You can talk about that in a letter, right? Perceived commitment to the specialty is also up there. Evidence of professionalism and ethics, perceived interest in the program, leadership qualities, right? So all of these things are sort of evidence-based, if you will, okay? And those are the things you can touch upon. So a lot of people ask me, and I'm sure there are other people in GME here, is there a secret language to the letters? The students and the residents are very fixated on the last line of the letter, you know, and what's the last line of the letter? So I'll talk to you a little bit about this. There are some standardized performance descriptors that are used by many people. In general, we're talking about clerkship directors, people who write dean's letters, and program directors, fellowship program directors, and residency program directors. Do everybody use these? No. But they're common enough that I think you should be aware of them. So there are many dialects, if you will. I'm going to present sort of the common dialect. So here are the words, I think, starting from here, which would be no qualifier. So there's just no descriptor before whatever you're going to say. Starting with good, very good, excellent, outstanding, and then absolutely superb. So we start with the negative, and then as you go down, you get more positive. And where I would say the cut point between negative and positive is probably here. So, you know, in GME speak, good means kind of bad. Very good means sort of bad also. But not entirely and not in everyone's vocabulary. But if you're using this, it sort of does, right? So, and then excellent is certainly positive. Outstanding is, you know, one of the top. And then there are a whole bunch of variations. Absolutely superb, an absolute star, a complete gem. Those types of things are a little bit, are sort of at the top. So as a general rule, this is sort of how I would view it. So how do you use these descriptors if you'd like in a letter? So here's an example of a last line. This is how I write it and how a lot of my colleagues do, but certainly not everybody. In summary, I recommend Jane Doe as an outstanding candidate for residency in radiology. So that would be at the end of the letter, and I would underline it. And by underlining it and having this format, you're telling the reader, like, you speak the language. You speak GME. Like when you say understanding, you mean this understanding, right? Because you're using the format that they're going to recognize. So if you think someone's between excellent and understanding, and this is sort of a really like a go-to kind of phrase for a lot of us, excellent to understanding, to outstanding, you can use that as well, excellent to outstanding, or any combination of the others. You can use these to describe multiple aspects of performance, so they're not just for the last line of the letter. You can pepper them throughout, you know, so I thought her, you know, interpersonal skills were outstanding and need to say a few things, and then she has excellent medical knowledge, right? It can't be that students really aren't going to be outstanding at everything. And these words give you a way to sort of, you know, paint a very realistic picture by not using complete superlatives for everything. So telling it like it is, it's important not to overinflate performance for students or faculty or for residents. Now, this is tough because we have to balance our need as faculty to be honest in what we write with our commitment and responsibility to support our students and to support our residents. That's really one of, I consider, my major responsibilities. So, you know, it's a balance. I'll give you some suggestions for this. So I think you always have to be honest. You know, we are accountable to the public and to the profession. It can be dangerous for patients if you overinflate someone's performance and they end up in a setting where they're in over their head. Okay, so remember that the patients are, you know, they're not students anymore where they have a resident or somebody else. They're like the extra person and there's a lot of sort of safety net underneath them. You know, once they get into the residency and fellowship level, there's a real world responsibility that these folks have, not to minimize at all what the students have, but it's, you understand, I mean, these people are functioning as their physicians. The other thing is you can set the student up for failure. There are many different residency and fellowship programs. There are many different settings. They're certainly not all the same. And the last thing we would want is for a student to have their performance overinflated and end up in a setting where they're just going to have problems. And this happens. So I'd say overall we want to support our students. We want to support our residents. But we need to be honest and keep these things in mind. If you students are truly outstanding in every way, if your letter is full of superlatives, then that can undermine the credibility of it as well. This is a great editorial from the New England Journal of Medicine from 1983. It's called Sounding Board, and I'll read it to you. So, tonight I traveled to a wondrous place, a fantasy land of sugar plums and fairy tales. Since some of you may have never had the opportunity to visit this glorious place, let me tell you about it. It is a land where everyone will, quote, make a fine physician, where people have, quote, excellent interpersonal skills and good rapport with their peers. In this land, about 1/10 of inhabitants are among the finest I have ever worked with. A full quarter are outstanding, and almost all are in the upper quarter. Everyone is a pleasure to work with, has excellent initiative, is enthusiastic and conscientious, and possesses an above-average fund of knowledge. A few people are quiet or shy and get off to a slow start, but they all, quote, blossom during their clinical years, and no one has reservations. So, as you write your letters, this sentiment is out there, and I think, sometimes if you write a letter that seems too unrealistic, you could get this reaction. So I thought that was interesting. So when should you not write a letter? Well, I'd say if you didn't work with a student enough, you can't write them a letter, and you can make that judgment for yourself. If you can't write a strong letter, so, I just spent a few minutes telling you that you need to write a realistic letter, but that doesn't mean you should be writing weak letters. I think if you can't write a strong letter, then you probably should decline. And I'll tell you about how to approach that situation. If your letter doesn't fit with the trainee's needs, so I think if you're going to be a letter writer, one of your roles as faculty is to help advise the student. So if you're going to decline a student or a resident, you might engage with them and ask them, so you're applying to, I noticed you're applying to, OBGYN, and you told me that Dr. Jones, who's in medicine, is writing a letter, and I'm in medicine, and you have another person in pediatrics, so maybe I'm not the right, maybe you need an OBGYN letter. Sometimes the students, they really need this kind of guidance. So, a way that you can redirect the student is if you realize that, you're not going to fit in well with their application. If the student won't waive their right to the letter, I think that you should seriously reconsider, writing the letter. It's a tricky balance. You're not really supposed to pressure students into the waiver. Most students and residents, when they send you their paperwork, they're just going to send you, their stuff, and the waiver form will be in there. If you don't get it, I usually just request it and say, did you include? I think you forgot the waiver form or something. It's very important. If they don't waive their right to the letter, it's definitely a red flag. And as I mentioned earlier, it can expose you to liability, depending upon what you say. So we can look at a letter here. This is a letter. It says, "To whom it may concern, Dr. Arnold Berger is the son of one of my dearest friends. He is a capable and reliable young man who has had a fine education and training. I'm convinced that he would be able to work satisfactorily in his field." Signed, Albert Einstein. So I'm not going to argue with Albert Einstein and his ability to endorse people. But the first thing you should realize is that this is just an endorsement. This is not a letter of recommendation, right? There's no description really other than, I think he'd be good, right? The reason I put it in here is because it's an example of another situation where you should not write a letter, and that is if you have a conflict of interest. So we do get these letters. This person is the son of one of his dearest friends. Didn't really work with the person in terms of what he was saying, but I've read a lot of these letters. While I haven't worked with Jonathan, I've known him for 25 years since he was a child, and already it's like, how did this get in here? Really. So don't do it. It's not going to advantage the student. If you get pressure from family or friends, you can just tell them that that kind of letter goes over really poorly to me. All right, so what do you do if you feel like you can't write a letter? So the first thing I would say would be to let the trainee know early. They need to get other letters. Advise the trainee, that's your role, and explore who else might write their letter. I think we talked about that. And I would encourage the student to seek further advice. And so, if they're a medical student, you can refer them to the dean's office, the dean of students' office, or to their faculty advisor. Okay. I spoke with Peter Gliotto, and that's what his suggestion was for the Sinai students. For residents, I would, who you feel you can't write for, I would refer them to speak with their program director. As we sort of move into the end part of the talk, finally, great letters of recommendation. They're rarely perfect. They usually have many or some great elements, so nothing is a work of, Nobel Prize-worthy literature. They often don't fit any mold, but they're impactful, and I think style and overall feel matter. So people often say, well, is there a template I can use? And there are some programs, emergency medicine, I think, has a standardized letter, but there really isn't a template. It's more about, incorporating a couple of principles and a few basic ways to start the letter and use words, but ultimately it should be something that you create individually. You want to illustrate through examples and specifics. You want to paint a picture of the trainee doing as much as knowing. And great letters fit well with the other parts of an application, right? So the letters are not in isolation. They're going to fit with the dean's letter, and they're going to fit with everything else they list. And there's going to be a picture of this person that's going to come together through all of it. So getting started, if you're thinking about getting started, we'll have a little quiz. So how do great writers start writing? Do they A, sit at an outdoor cafe in Paris? Do they B, ask and receive divine intervention? Do they C, read some Poe or Hemingway to become creatively inspired? Or do they D, follow Norman Mailer's advice? So the answer is they follow Norman Mailer's advice. That's Norman Mailer. He's an American author. And his advice was, apply your bottom to the chair, meaning that you just got to sit down and do it. There's no romanticism about it. And for those of you who write a lot, chapters and grants and papers, you know that you just got to sit down every day and do it. So it's no different for a letter, I think. So I'll take you through. We talked about a lot of examples of how to write the letters and good ways to phrase things. So I'll just take you through three brief examples. These are from real letters, and you can tell me what you think. So here's one that I read, I think a couple years ago. He was the best third-year medical student I've ever worked with. He ran the entire service and functioned at the fellow level. So what do people think of that? Pretty hard to believe, right? I don't believe that a third-year medical student ran the service and functioned at a fellow level, right? Unless there's something wrong over at that place, right? So the problem here is more than just overinflating the performance of the student. When I read this, then I read the rest of the letter, I wonder about the rest of the letter, right? Because if this was in there, then what about the next paragraph? And you can undermine your credibility if you say something a little too far. Here's another one, real example from a letter. This was the only comment about this student's performance. It was a brief letter, a couple of paragraphs. And the middle one, which was basically this, was about performance. Anna made clinical rounds with me on the ID service. Her knowledge is excellent, and she has a strong interest in clinical medicine. So what do people think about that? Yeah, I mean, he either doesn't know her, or he knows her and he just didn't say very much about her. If he really, if they made rounds together, there must have been something to put down. She must have done a presentation, or she must have spoken to a patient. And this is not someone who was an observer. This is a U.S. allopathic medical student who did a rotation at a major university hospital. So it's a little anemic in terms of what it's going to do for the student. Okay, and interest is great, but I need more than interested people to take care of the patients, and I think you would agree. So here's the last one that I'll finish with. There's a real letter. During medical school, he struggled with his health, but got help and is now improving. He identified time management as a challenge, and then a little later on, in summary, he is a good medical student. He is now on an upward trajectory. So what do people think of this? Yeah. Yeah. So my advice would be, don't write this letter. There may have been a reason, hopefully there was a reason why this was done, but, just in terms of how we read this in GME. So, his health should not be, it's a too personal issue, it should not be in there. God help, and he's now improving, which means he's not better. I mean, if you're really reading this with the GME eye, that's what it means. He's improving, but he's not better. We know because, so he identified time management as a challenge. Also, that's not good. In summary, he's a good medical student, right? So this person is using the words, letting us know that he's writing in this sort of dialect, and he's now on an upward trajectory, which is sort of like he's now improving. Now on an upward trajectory means he's not there yet. He's on the trajectory. So an upward trajectory is this. So like he could be here. And so it's not going to help the student. I would say don't get into these types of issues. Leave this for the dean's office to figure out. And that's it. So happy to take questions, and thank you very much. Yes?
Thank you for the outstanding presentation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, yes. So what are your thoughts on, especially for rotators to the department, spend 4 weeks, kind of a department-wide letter of recommendation where a couple of people sign it, and there are some excerpts of different comments in there. In some ways, I'm in a small field, radiation oncology, so we tend to see the same letters over and over. It becomes a little bit canned and a little bit less personal, but at the same time, you can get more opinions of people who might have worked with people a little bit closer in there.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a role for that in the right setting. I think a letter by one person who knows them is probably better. But if that's what you can put together for the student, as long as it includes some of the direct observation and what people saw the student do. You have to work with what you have. I think it would have to, as long as you include as much observation about the student, and whoever's writing the letter, it should be probably one of the people who worked with the student, as opposed to 4 junior faculty and then the chair writes the letter. Like, we would recognize that the chair didn't have any contact, and the student just wanted the chair to write the letter because the chair is the chair or something. So I think if you're going to do that, maybe at least one of the people who worked with them should probably write the letter. It'll give it a much more personalized approach too. That would be my suggestion. Yes?
2 questions. One is just a practical question about your thoughts on bold facing or underlining phrases or sentences outside of the sort of just outstanding adjective or whatever. And the second is, as somebody who has interviewed applicants, a lot of the letters do feel like they're sort of hyperbolic or superlative, and sometimes I actually don't pay that much attention to them. So I'm actually curious that they have been ranked so highly, and I'm sort of wondering, is that true actually even nowadays? That looked like it was about a decade old or whatever, the study, so.
The fellowship, the fellowship data is from 2007. I think it's still true. I mean, talking to my fellowship colleagues, I think, look, there's obviously some variability, but I wouldn't take the chance, if I was writing, I wouldn't take the chance that they're not going to be felt to be important. In terms of bolding, and then the data from the program directors is from last year, so that's more recent. But in terms of bolding, I think you don't want to make it too busy on the page. I'd sort of leave that, I think up to you. It depends what the letter looks like visually. I personally don't really do it, other than other than those descriptors. Sometimes I'll bold at the top before it says "Dear Program Director." I usually put a line above with their name and their their application number, and I'll bold that. Other questions? Yes. Oh, I think she wants you to wait for the mic so that the people at the...
I have a pretty loud voice, but you spoke a lot about if you didn't feel comfortable writing a letter for a trainee of some sort. This may be personal on my standpoint, but if you have what you would consider not enough exposure to a trainee, or if you had someone who was an observer or an early level med student who was pretty limited in their ability to do exactly be on daily rounds, engage and with specific patients. But at the same time, you're very much enthusiastic about the patient's interest, enthusiasm. They're doing more than their peers are doing as far as showing their interest. How do you go about writing a letter for someone like that, where they are limited, you're limited in your exposure with them, but at the same time you see kind of this quality in them that you'd like a medical school or a resident director to see?
So I think the case of the students and the observers are very different. An early student, like I think you had mentioned a second year, if a second year student asks you, my response to the second year student would be, you need to go through your clinical rotations and meet people, and you need to get letters from those. I think if someone got a letter from like their ASM person or something, that might be, I don't know if that's going to be enough, because most students are getting letters from those clinical rotations either in the third or fourth year. So that's what I would say. And I'd say, listen, if you don't get any letters, come back to me. But then this person comes back in a year and a half and they have no one but me to write a letter still, that's a problem. The observers is different. My heart breaks for international medical graduates who are observers. It's very difficult for them to get these letters that encompass direct observation of competence. There's all sorts of restrictions. They can't talk to patients. They can't do this and that. I think for them, you just have to do the best you can. Programs understand that these folks are in a tough position.
Can you talk about, although limited to an observer?
Yeah, I would just, yep.
And prepared a presentation,
Yep, I would just say what you saw, and you can talk about presentations and initiative and how they were there, and you can do everything but, what you can't write about. Right. All right, well, thanks very much. Thank you.